They thought she was lost. They thought she didn't belong. On a grey November morning at Pearson International Airport in Toronto, a security supervisor named Glenn Murchison made a decision he would spend the rest of his career trying to undo. He saw a black woman standing in the wrong line, and he saw a problem to be managed. He didn't see the rank. He didn't see the 31 years of service. He didn't see Colonel Adanna Boateng-Hale of the Canadian Armed Forces, recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal, veteran of 3 international deployments, and the woman who would, in approximately 40 minutes, be the guest of honor at a ceremony inside that very terminal. He just saw a woman who, in his estimation, needed to be moved along. Adanna had flown in from CFB Trenton that morning on a connector flight, landing at 7:42 a.m. She was traveling in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a burgundy wool coat, and the kind of quiet composure that takes decades to build and seconds to misread. She had a carry-on bag, a leather portfolio under her arm, and a name tag around her neck from the Defense Department event that had already begun in the International Arrivals Hall, where the Department of National Defense was hosting a Remembrance Week reception for senior officers and their families. She was early. She always was. The reception area had been partially cordoned off, and a temporary check-in table had been set up near Gate C's overflow corridor, a detail coordinated between the airport authority and DND Logistics. Adanna had been given a printed access pass and told, specifically, to present at that table upon arrival. She was standing precisely where she was supposed to be. That was when Glenn Murchison appeared. Murchison was 17 years into his role as a senior security supervisor at Pearson. He was the kind of man who had grown comfortable with authority in spaces where no one questioned it. He wore his lanyard like a badge of importance, walked with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to people stepping aside, and had developed, over the years, a very specific instinct for who belonged and who didn't. He would have told you, if asked, that it wasn't about race. He would have believed it too. He approached Adanna from the left, cutting through a cluster of travelers near the rope barrier. "Ma'am." His tone was the professional equivalent of a hand on the shoulder. "This area is restricted. There's a private function set up here. You'll need to move to the general arrivals zone." Adanna looked at him. She held up the access lanyard. "I'm attending the function." Murchison glanced at it the way a person glances at a receipt they've already decided is incorrect. "This zone is for DND personnel and invited guests only." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm one of them." He paused. The pause was not the pause of a man reconsidering. It was the pause of a man deciding how to rephrase. "Do you have photo ID and an invitation letter?" "I have the access pass you can see around my neck, issued by the Department of National Defense. I also have my military ID in my bag, which I'm happy to show you. I'll need to see that." She reached into her portfolio, unhurried. She had done this before, not at airports specifically, but in rooms, in meetings, in hallways, where people looked at her and calculated wrong. She had learned not to waste emotion on the calculation. She pulled out her military identification card and handed it to Murchison. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at it again. The card read, "Colonel Adanna Boateng-Hale, Canadian Armed Forces." There was a photograph. It was unmistakably her. "I'll need to verify this with event staff," he said, handing it back. "That's fine," she said. He made a call on his radio. While he did, Adanna stood quietly, hands clasped in front of her, watching the terminal fill with morning arrivals, families with strollers, business travelers with their rolling bags, a group of students with matching backpacks. She didn't tap her foot. She didn't check her phone. She had the stillness of someone who had waited in far worse conditions than a Toronto airport corridor. The call was taking longer than it should have. A younger security officer, a woman named T. Ford by her name tag, drifted over and stood slightly behind Murchison. She caught Adanna's eye once, quickly, and looked away. Murchison finished his radio call. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to wait in the general area while we sort this out. The event coordinator is currently unavailable, and we can't confirm your access without." "With respect," Adanna said, her voice dropping to a register she rarely used outside of a briefing room. "I've presented valid military identification issued by the Government of Canada. I have a departmental access pass around my neck. I'm standing at the designated check-in point as instructed by the event organizers. I've been nothing but cooperative, and you're asking me to leave." Murchison straightened. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to wait in a different location while." "Why?" The word was simple. One syllable. It landed in the conversation like a stone dropped in water. Protocol, he said. Whose protocol? He didn't answer immediately, and in that gap, Officer Ford shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. It was the movement of someone who had noticed something and didn't know what to do with the noticing. Sir, Ford said quietly, the pass is a DND-issued clearance. I think we should. I've got it, Ford. His tone closed the conversation down. He turned back to Adanna. Ma'am, if you don't move to the general waiting area voluntarily, I'm going to have to escalate this to airport security management. Adanna looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with hurt, with something colder and more measured, the look of a person who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Then escalate, she said. He did. What Glenn Murchison did not know, could not have known, though a more careful man might have thought to ask, was that the DND liaison officer coordinating the event was currently standing 20 meters away, on the other side of the rope barrier, watching the entire exchange. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Osi-Mensah had been watching since Murchison's first approach. He had initially assumed it would resolve itself in 30 seconds. When it didn't, he waited. When Murchison called for escalation, Osi-Mensah put down his coffee and walked over. He was in full uniform. He introduced himself to the security supervisor with the particular precision of someone who chooses their words very carefully in professional settings. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Osi-Mensah, DND event coordinator. I've been standing over there for the last 6 minutes. Is there a problem? Murchison looked at him. We're having difficulty confirming this woman's access credentials. Her credentials are valid, Osi-Mensah said. She's Colonel Boateng-Hale. She's the guest of honor at this event. The silence that followed was not a brief pause. It was the kind of silence that has texture and weight. Murchison looked at Adanna, then at Osi-Mensah, then at the lanyard, then, apparently involuntarily, at the military ID he had handed back to her 2 minutes ago. We were waiting for confirmation from. You had confirmation, Osi-Mensah said. She handed it to you. There was nothing theatrical about the way he said it. No raised voice, no edge of performance. Just fact, laid down flat. Adanna said nothing. She simply picked up her portfolio from where she had set it on the counter and walked through the rope barrier into the reception area. Officer Ford held it open for her. Inside the arrivals hall, the reception was already in motion. Round tables with white linen, a podium at the front of the room, photographs of Canadian Forces personnel on mounted display boards along the far wall. About 40 people in attendance. Senior officers, family members, a delegation from Veterans Affairs, and 2 members of Parliament who had come specifically for this event. One of those MPs, a woman named Claudette Renaud, who sat on the Standing Committee on National Defence, spotted Adanna the moment she entered and crossed the room immediately. Adanna, there you are. We were starting to wonder. She embraced her briefly. Everything all right? You look like you just came from a fight. I came from a lineup, Adanna said simply. Renaud looked at her, then toward the corridor, where Murchison was still standing, now speaking rapidly into his radio. What happened? A man decided I didn't belong here. Adanna smoothed the front of her coat. He was incorrect. She was a politician, which meant she had 2 modes, public and operational. She shifted into operational. Do you want to make a formal complaint? I want to give my remarks first, Adanna said. We'll talk after. She did. The remarks Adanna Boateng-Hale gave at that podium lasted 14 minutes. She spoke about her father, who had emigrated from Ghana to Nova Scotia in 1974 and spent 20 years as a mechanical engineer before Adanna was born. She spoke about enlisting at 19, about the first time she was deployed, about the particular experience of serving a country that sometimes forgot, in small and large ways, that people who looked like her had always been part of it. She spoke about her team, the soldiers she had commanded, the ones she had brought home, the ones whose names she still said quietly on November mornings. She did not mention what had happened in the corridor. She didn't need to. When she finished, the room was completely still for a moment before the applause started. MP Renaud was wiping her eyes. The DND Chief of Staff, who was seated in the front row, stood first. Out in the corridor, Glenn Murchison was still there. He had been joined by his immediate supervisor, the airport's Director of Security Operations, a man named Bernard Calloway, who had arrived after receiving a radio escalation that had, apparently, been more interesting than expected. Calloway had been briefed. by O.C. Mensah, by the DND liaison desk, and by 2 separate MP staffers who had been present during the exchange and had taken out their phones. Murchison was explaining himself. He used the words protocol and standard procedure several times. He said he had been following his training. He said there was no way he could have known. Calloway listened without expression. "She handed you her military ID," Calloway said. "Yes, but I needed, Glenn." Calloway's voice was quiet. "She handed you a government-issued military ID card with her photograph and rank on it. She was standing at the designated DND check-in point. She was wearing the event lanyard. And you called for escalation. I was following." "What exactly were you following?" Murchison didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. That afternoon, while Adanna was in a closed-door briefing with the Standing Committee, the airport's formal complaint process was initiated. Not by Adanna, she had not yet filed anything, but by Lieutenant Colonel O.C. Mensah, who had submitted a written account of the incident to both the Airport Authority and the Department of National Defense, noting the date, the time, the exact location, and a precise description of what he had witnessed. Officer Ford, when approached separately, provided a corroborating account. She did so voluntarily. No one had pressured her. In the weeks that followed, an internal review was conducted by the Airport Authority. The findings were not made fully public, but what became known was this: Glenn Murchison was removed from frontline supervisory duties pending retraining. A formal apology was issued by the Airport Authority to Colonel Boateng-Hale. The incident was flagged in a broader review of how security personnel at major Canadian transport hubs interact with military and government officials. None of that was the part that stayed with people who had been there. What stayed was a smaller moment, about 15 minutes after Adanna had walked through that rope barrier into the reception. Bernard Calloway had come inside briefly to speak with the DND coordinator. On his way out, he passed the table where Adanna was seated with Renault and 2 other officers. He stopped. He introduced himself. He said he was sorry for what had happened and that it should not have. Adanna thanked him. She was gracious. She had been gracious the entire morning. Then Calloway paused and asked the question that was clearly sitting heavily on him. "Colonel, was there a point where you considered just leaving, just going around him?" Adanna looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I was exactly where I was supposed to be." She let that sit. "If I had left," she continued, "he would have believed he was right. And the next person he stopped, who didn't have a uniform, who didn't have a ceremony to walk into, who didn't have an MP watching from across the room, that person would have had no one standing at the barrier for them. I didn't stay for myself. I stayed because the line had to hold somewhere." Calloway nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. He left. C. Mensah, who had overheard from 2 seats away, looked at Adanna. "You're going to make me rewrite my remarks for Friday's address." "Keep them," she said. "Just add that part about the line." He did. In the months after the incident, Colonel Adanna Boateng-Hale continued her work with the Canadian Armed Forces Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee, a role she had held for 2 years and had never, until that morning, spoken about publicly. She gave one interview to a national outlet in which she described what had happened without embellishment and without bitterness. She said that what concerned her wasn't Glenn Murchison specifically. What concerned her was the assumption behind his decisions, the one that told him, without a single piece of evidence, that the woman standing at the barrier was the problem to be managed rather than the guest to be welcomed. "I had the credentials," she said. "I always had the credentials. The question was never whether I belonged. The question was whether he was willing to see it." Glenn Murchison returned to a non-supervisory role after completing mandatory equity training. The airport's security protocols for government and military events were revised. Officer Ford received a commendation in her personnel file for the accuracy and promptness of her corroborating report. And on a cold Friday morning in late November, at a public remembrance ceremony at a community centre in Scarborough, attended by veterans, students and local officials, Lieutenant Colonel O.C. Mensah stood at a podium and read the final line of his address. He said, "The uniform doesn't make the soldier makes the soldier. And sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier does isn't in a field overseas. Sometimes it's standing still at a rope barrier in an airport and refusing to move when someone tells them they don't belong, because they know, in 31 years of bone-deep certainty, that they do. There was no tape of Colonel Boateng-Hale's face when she heard that line. But the people sitting near her that morning said she didn't clap right away like everyone else did. She just sat with it for a second, quietly, the way you sit with something true. That is the kind of courage that doesn't make the front page. It doesn't come with a muzzle flash or a courtroom door swinging open. It's the courage of staying in place when every social reflex is telling you to make it easy, to step back, to give the person with the lanyard and the radio the path of least resistance just to get through the morning. Adanna Boateng-Hale did not make it easy, and because she didn't, the corridor got a little bit more honest. Glenn Murchison had one chance to look at the credentials in front of him and see what was actually there. He chose not to, and in that choice, he didn't just embarrass himself, he set into motion an accountability that outlasted his authority, his justifications, and his version of events. If you've ever been the person standing at the barrier, with every piece of paper you were supposed to have, and someone still found a reason to make you wait, you already know what this story is about. And if you've ever been the person holding the radio, deciding who looks the part, maybe ask yourself what, exactly, you are looking for. What do you think? Did the airport go far enough, or should the consequences have been stronger? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. Because the voices that deserve to be heard don't always come through a microphone. Sometimes they come through a corridor, in a wool coat, carrying 31 years of service and not a single apology for where they're standing.